All right. Hey, well, it's good to see you, and thanks so much for taking the time to talk.
You too, Mike. My pleasure.
Yeah, yeah, and the flight over was fine. You didn't run into any problems?
No problems. Very long, but that's to be expected.
Yeah, and exactly what is the flight path from, well, you were going out of New York to Kabul?
Right. For me, the flight stopped in Frankfurt,
Uh-huh.
where I actually had the chance to leave the airport and go have lunch in town, um, and then to Dubai for an overnight layover,
Mm-hmm.
and then a morning flight from Dubai to Kabul.
Ah, ah. And now this is your second trip to the Afghanistan National Institute of Music, correct?
Yes. Yeah.
Uh-huh. And how is this position that you're filling, how is that funded? Are you
It's been funded by it's been funded by the U.S. Embassy. So we in January, my first trip here, they have a very extensive program of guest artists that they call the Winter Music Academy,
uh-huh.
and there's funding coming from many different sources for that. And the U.S. Embassy is one of the supporters of that. The embassy in Kabul, and so when I had brought up the idea of coming back in the spring, sort of independently, and another guest artist from the Winter Academy had also suggested that, who's also an American, a violinist named Eden McAdams Sommer. We ended up talking to people at the embassy and the faculty and administration at the music school. Uh, Definitely made that happen for us.
Ah, yes, yes. And so you've just arrived, and what has happened so far on this trip?
Uh, well, I keep falling asleep at the wrong time of day. But aside from that, we did manage to get in for a full school day of teaching this morning and afternoon. And so showed up to the school around 8:30 in the morning or so. And in fact, Eden, the violinist who's here, she had just arrived at 6 in the morning at the airport. So she was basically coming straight from the plane. I at least had gotten to have a night's sleep.
Hmm.
Uh, and we sort of met up with our colleagues, and I headed into the guitar studio, and a student was just in there practicing the Via Lobos Prelude Number One.
Hmm.
And so I was there with my other faculty member, and she said, "See it." His name was Sayamak, and hey, Sayamak, do you want a lesson? So uh, so the way the schedule is structured is sometimes a little unclear. I think uh, there are certain classes that students will be attending, and depending on what grade they're in, they're occupied at certain times of the day. But then they'll have sort of scheduled practice blocks as well as lessons.
Hmm.
Um, and so I think while I'm here, at least a lot of those practice blocks will become lesson times, or even sometimes just supervised practicing. And making sure that the practicing that's done is actually done in a productive way. Um, and I think that's one of my real challenges here is to, um, because I'm only here for 11 days, I have to do my best to not only give a lot of information, but give them a way to use that information once I'm not here anymore, and make sure that they're practicing correctly and really being able to be efficient in how they develop.
Hmm. Yes. But the Institute also, it's not only Western instruments that are there being taught, it's also traditional instruments, I understand.
Right. The school, that was something that was an important point when they started the school. And I think that there is a definite element of cultural diplomacy to this school, because there are a lot of international teachers, international organizations funding the school. It definitely shows politically that there's an attempt by the countries who, first of all, have fought a war against the Taliban and who have been a military presence here, and then have continued as a development presence here, are trying to help Afghanistan grow in a more meaningful way than just kicking out the old tyrants.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it was very important that the founder of the school is Afghan. He's not a Westerner. And for him, both for his own feelings and as sort of a political nod to show that this is really a school for Afghans and not just a front for Western development, it was very important to have Afghan instruments be a part of that. And Afghan traditional music is very closely tied to Indian music. And so they actually call it the Indo-Afghan music department. So there are Afghan instruments like the rubab, and then tied into that tradition are instruments we associate with India, the sarod, sitar, tabla. So yeah, and that's really cool to get a chance to be around that as well.
Yeah, do you ever come together for like collaborative workshops?
Yeah, in fact, on this particular trip, the rubab teacher, Farid Shefta, sorry, not Shefta, that's a different teacher, Payanda Mohammed Nekar, composed a piece that's based on an Afghan raga, and so we did a sort of flash rehearsal today. So we had rubab and tabla very clearly leading the way, while I on classical guitar and two guest violinists played along with this piece. It's very interesting. There's a definite improvisational element to that music that is not something that we're customarily taught in our Western classical training. And so it's a little bit out of the comfort zone for us. It's also very linear, non-harmonic music. The sort of harmony foundation of it is just a scale and sort of a drone. And so, yeah, I have a little bit of familiarity with this music from my last trip. So it wasn't a total adjustment, but definitely different than what we're used to, and really cool, really exciting.
Wow.
So, yeah.
Sounds wonderful. Too bad I don't know if they're videotaping any of these sessions or anything, but it would be wonderful to hear, you know.
Hopefully something will be recorded. We're going to be performing these collaborations next Wednesday and next Thursday. This Wednesday and Thursday. We have a concert at the school on Wednesday and a concert at the Canadian Embassy on Thursday. And so hopefully one of those will be recorded.
Wonderful, wonderful. Now, one thing we talked about in the interview prior to your classical guitar weekend performances was the fact that this is also associated, or a lot of the children are in orphanages. Has that changed much since your last visit? Do you know?
Not really, and that's actually another thing that was a deliberate choice by the school and by the founder, Ahmad Sarmast. They wanted to really integrate with the most disadvantaged communities in Kabul, and those are street children and orphans. A lot of these kids would otherwise be selling plastic bags on the street. or if they're lucky, maybe phone cards or cigarettes. Um, and so this was definitely an attempt to say that this is not just for sort of the elite few in Kabul who can afford such a thing, but all of the tuition is subsidized, and they run a bus between the orphanage and the school every morning. And they actually are in the process of renovating an old building on the grounds that will become a dormitory for the students. And so that's going to be a pretty serious development also in sort of the housing question that goes along with working with disadvantaged students.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Interesting. And so, do you find that the whole philosophy is it really is about education, or is there an aspect of the philosophy that is hoping to lead any of the young students to have a career in music?
I mean, I think that the fundamental goal of the school, I think, is education primarily. And I think that beyond that, there's a hope to revive a musical tradition in Afghanistan that was lost when, during the period of civil war, when various mujahideen factions would persecute musicians, and finally when the Taliban emerged as the governing force, just a really brutal suppression of music, and basically wiped out the musical culture in Afghanistan. So the hope, there's still, even here we are 12 years after the fall of the Taliban, there's still no established music industry in Afghanistan.
Mm-hmm.
So it's hard to say that the hope is to send them into careers in music, because there's no such thing as a career in music.
Mm-hmm.
Now, there absolutely are, though. Actually, when I arrived today, William Harvey, who's the violin teacher and the director of the orchestra, I walked in on his business in music class. And so there's a hope that these students, when they graduate, will be able to establish that music industry, and that they can be the core of a new community and a new industry where there is an opportunity for professional musicianship.
Mm-hmm.
That's not going to be the reality for a lot of students, just the way it's not the reality for a lot of American conservatory graduates.
Mm-hmm.
And so, if nothing else, they will come out with a high school level education. Many of the students are girls who also have had to struggle their way back into education in Afghanistan.
Mm-hmm.
So they're being given tools and a bit more power and opportunity in their lives, whether or not they end up using that to be musicians.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Interesting. Interesting. Well, I look forward to our conversation a week from now, or next Friday, just to see how things are progressing for you. This is a great, thank you so much for taking the time. And there's a couple questions I have that I'd like to do off the tape, so I'm going to turn that off and just stay on one second.